Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode we're going back to the medieval period to the region of the English-Scottish border to find out more about the border reivers. Border conflict at this time wasn't just limited to royal armies of the two kingdoms of England and Scotland fighting in large-scale battles. For centuries, the area was subject to raids, thefts and violence by groups known as reivers, who families like the Percys at Alnwick Castle were usually in charge of subduing, or attempting to, or sometimes encouraging. We were joined by one of our favourite returning guests on the podcast, Master Longbowman Andy Rice, to talk all things border reivers. Please enjoy. So we would like to welcome back once again to the Alnwick Castle podcast one of our favourite returning guests. It's Andy Rice. How are you, Andy?
I'm absolutely fine. Good morning to you.
We are live once again in Artisans Courtyard on quite a blustery summer's day.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it has been very blustery the last couple of days, but we've managed with the wind, which is quite good.
Yeah, typical Northumberland weather.
Oh, yes.
Which is appropriate for what we're talking about today.
Indeed, yes. Very much.
Because what we are talking about is border reivers.
Indeed, yes.
So we should probably start with, who were the border reivers?
Right, well, border reiving. Reiving is essentially thieving. That's what it is. Reiving equals thieving. And it went on for about 400 years. They were essentially families. They were surnames, the riding surnames. They're not clans. Clans is in Scotland, the Highlands of Scotland. They are known as surnames. And they were surnames, if you have the surnames of Charlton, Crozer, Nixon, Dodds, Hetheringtons, Fosters, Armstrongs, of course, were a big one. Elliots, you've got Grahams. All of those names, and more of them, were all riding families. And essentially what they did for about 400 years, this area, the borderland, because of it being in between England and Scotland, it was a massive area that was kept in a very turbulent state. And the borderers themselves ended up getting together in their families. And it didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, the whole thing went up and down, round, sideways. Essentially what they would do, because they essentially ended up getting burned out when an army went from Scotland to England, or an England-Scotland one, reiving became a way of life. It became stealing from other people to subsist, to stay alive. And then, of course, that became more ingrained into their society. And then you also had the problems, of course, that in the society they lived in, if a man died, his estate would be divided up amongst his sons. Now, note I said sons. You've got what's called primogeniture.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, primogeniture basically meant it was only the males that would inherit, unless you were the single female descendant.
Okay.
However, if you married, that then all became your husband's.
Yes, he inherits on your behalf.
But the problem is, it didn't actually take account of how big an estate it was. So if you were talking about a peasant's hovel, you were talking about a tiny scrap of land that was going to be divided about how many people. And people couldn't exist on that, and they ended up banding together. As I said, it ended up essentially fighting each other all this time, and you'd have families attacking each other on a nightly basis. These raids went on a nightly basis, all the way through, particularly the autumn and winter. And it was going on all the time.
And was this an England versus Scotland thing? Was it at both sides of the border, or would these families attack other families on, quote-unquote, their side?
Well, depends on which side you're talking. The border reivers, the border families didn't actually mostly see it as an England-Scotland business. Northumberland originally extended all the way from the Humber all the way to Edinburgh. Now, just because the Romans turned up and put a big wall there and somebody put an administrative line across and said, that's the border, didn't mean a thing to them. They were borderers. And that's not to say that the borderline wasn't important. It was. The borderline had its own importance, majorly in the fact of evading justice, because you could slip across the border. And then you could do it the other way as well, so England and Scotland. But in terms of England and Scotland, yes, there was obviously a lot of cross-border raiding. It would go on like that. But it wasn't in terms of, that's an English settlement, we'll go for that, or that's a Scottish settlement, we'll go for that. It was, are they Elliots? Are they Crozers? are the Armstrongs. It was family against family more than anything. And it literally went upwards, sideways, everywhere you could think of. Because it was essentially, if you think of it in terms of now, you'd be thinking in terms of, right, you've got a council estate over there, and you've got another council estate over there, and another estate over there. Well, if they've got 40 more cows than I've got, well, I'm going to go and raid them. I want their cows because it's money, and I want that. And that's essentially how they viewed it.
And this went on, as you said, for 400 years or thereabouts. That's a long time. Was
Indeed.
anywhere, or was there any period that was safe?
Safe? Well, that's a very that's a nebulous term.
Safe from
there
the
was a
Reivers.
period of about 50 odd years where it seemed to settle down a little bit, where Scotland and England didn't actually go for each other and all the rest of it. But at the same time, it was still very much a thing. It just kept on the way it did for so long. And like I said, it became ingrained in society. Instead of just being the occasional raid now, we're talking about people who go, right, well, we're going to do this because it's part of our culture, more or less. It's what we do.
We are in front of your tables of
Yes.
the equipment and accoutrements of a master longbowman.
Yes.
What kind of weapons were Reivers using? Did they have access to similar things as professional soldiers?
Yes. Of course, the longbow is still in use, for as we said, for over 400 years, because reiving reached its zenith actually in the late Tudor Elizabethan period. Now, the longbow is still in use, and the longbow, of course, is a wonderful weapon for a thief on horseback, because if they're raiding, it's a quiet weapon, but it also can use fire. You can use fire as a weapon, so it's a weapon of terror. So they'd use the longbow, and they'd have their arrows made, etc. They would do it exactly the same way as anybody else did. But they also had their own defences, of course, their own things. They would have, like we've got there, a padded jack, and that was the most ubiquitous defence. You normally got it, and they could make it themselves. It was just simply layers padded together and then quilted to make a defensive layer. So you'd have that. You might have a bit of mail. You would have a bonnet. You would have a steel bonnet, as they call them. You would have your helmet, and it didn't have to be the most fashionable thing ever. You could have something that was 100 years old, but it would still do it. And of course, you've got your swords and your daggers and everything else. But of course, now you're also moving into the era of firearms. So they carry matchlocks, but of course they're very slow loading, so they're more for their shock value than they are for any accuracy. But then, as the Elizabethan period goes on, you go into what's called wheel locks, and they can be spanned with a little key. They spin it round.
These are pistols.
Essentially, yeah, they're pistols. They're called dags. They call them dags. And they can essentially load them, span them, what they call span them, which is prepared, ready for firing. But even so, your firing rate is nowhere near as much as the longbow is. You're still only talking about 1 to 2 shots a minute. So most reivers would carry, if they had those firearms, would actually carry at least 2. So you'd carry 2 on either side in two cased holsters, either side of your saddle. So if you use one, discharge one, you've now got the next one to use as well. And of course, if everybody's got the same, and you've got a party of 50 reivers, you've got...
That's 100 chances.
It's good, 100 chances, yeah.
You mentioned that it got ingrained into society and culture. How did people adapt to the fact that if you had cows or you had livestock or anything worth stealing, there was a good chance that on any given time it would get reived?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously people had to be on alert. During the summer months, you get a bit of a break. Because during the summer months, the cattle are out there on the high fields, and they're being looked after out there, but they're spread across. Well, that's no good for a predatory band. They don't want that. They want something that's easy pickings. So they wait until autumn and winter. The ground's harder, so it makes easier going. And also, as well, the cattle and sheep, etc., are gathered in what they call the in-by fields. So they're more defensive. But, of course, people would obviously try and defend everything. So people would be awake. They'd have watches set to watch for the reivers. They also had a system we call bale fire, and essentially what you've got is a bale of straw which was sat on top of a tower or any high point, and if reivers were sighted, a raiding party was sighted, the beacons were lit. And of course you had a chain of beacons, so each beacon that lit, they'd obviously know that the Reivers were around. And of course, people would then prepare. They would get cattle in. And if you look at the way that people lived, it's quite surprising. You have vassal houses. There's a wonderful saying that was put forward by, I think it was George MacDonald Fraser in The Steel Bonnets, which is the seminal book on this, that living in the borders was living with defence. And it was. If you had a bit of money, you would actually, as a yeoman farmer, you would make yourself a vassal house. And a vassal house is essentially a fortified farmhouse. And the stones, they're actually as thick as the walls here. They're very, very thick walls. You lived on the first story. The story below was for you to get your cattle in, secure it, and then your main front door was actually up a level. Right. So you had a ladder or a collapsible stair, and then if the Reivers were around, you'd pull this in, shut the doors and bar them and hopefully do it, and that would hopefully stop them. But of course, if the Reivers came running to you and came riding to you, you're now going to get axes coming through doors, you're going to get that sort of thing going. And the only thing you could hope was that your defence and your neighbours would rally to your defence. And of course, again, it's back to your name. People lived in sort of family groups. So if you were Dodds, for instance, you'd have a lot of Dodds around you. So if you were getting attacked, your rider would go out, raise the alerts because they've already seen the beacons, etc. You would then have another army coming towards you. And of course, you have the wardens' troopers, which were stationed in various different places, so they could be alerted as well. That's, of course, if they hadn't been bribed to look the other way, right. Which happened. Quite a lot.
So we've got vassals, we've got castles.
And peel towers, of course.
Peel towers.
Yeah, peel towers.
A peel tower.
Again, it's a defensible tower. The idea being, if you're a bit more prosperous, you can build a peel tower. And a lot of the reiving families actually did have them. Johnny Armstrong had one at Gilnockie. It's a very famous one, as Gilnockie Tower. And if you look, it's well preserved. And if you go and have a look at that, you'll see how thick those walls are and also how defensible it could be. And of course, you have parapets at the top of that tower, which you could then just put longbows on and things like that, shoot down, have your alerts and everything else. So it's very useful.
Everybody's got their defensive structures.
Yes.
And then you mentioned the wardens,
yes.
who officially are the people trying to look after. So we've called them the borderlands or the borders. Yes. They were also known as the marchers.
The marchers, so the border marchers.
Can we talk a little bit about what the marchers were and who a warden of the marchers might have been?
Right. Well, for administrative purposes, the borderlands were divided into east, middle, and west. Yeah. And the same on the Scottish side. Only the Scottish side had a little bit called Liddesdale, and they had their own keeper, he answered to the Middlemarch Warden, because each one of these had their own warden and a wardenry. So they actually had their own officer, who was appointed by the Crown, of course, on either side. You have the Lord Wardens, and the Lord Warden's job was to try and enforce, if you could call it that, what was called the Leges Martiorium. And the Leges Martiorium was this whole area actually had a whole set of law that was made just for the borders, because it was that bad.
Wow.
So they try and enforce this, and they have various different jobs. One of the jobs, in fact, actually, the Percy family that lived here, they actually at one time, between various different centuries, they actually held the posts of all three of the border marches, east, middle, and west, all of those. They actually did so. And of course, there was a huge jealousy between them and, as we talked about yesterday, Mr. John Forster,
yes,
who became English Middlemarch Warden in round about 1560 odd. There's a huge rivalry that goes on because it was quite a coveted post, strangely enough. But one of the duties of the warden was, if you had cattle taken, etc., you as a borderer, by the way, had the right to basically ride a posse. So if your cattle were taken on the night, you could then gather together all your family and you could do what was called the hot trot, which was legal for 6 days. So you could then go thundering off. If it was crossing the border, though, what you had to do was have your lance with a burning piece of peat on the top of it as a signifier that you weren't on a raid, you were actually on a legal trot. And when if you did cross the border, what you had to do, the first person that you saw had to come with you as a witness. And it worked both ways. In the Leges Martiorium, it's in the law. Now, the warden himself might actually lead a hot trot like that. He might also have what they call warden's raids, which essentially was everything had got too hot for everything going on. So what they decided to do was raid a few towers, burn a few things, just to try and keep the locals in check. So they would do warden's raids. But one of their biggest jobs was if you had things taken, you also had recourse in law to go to the warden and file a bill. Every 40 days, you were supposed to go and meet your opposite number in Scotland. So the English one, by tradition, the English warden would ask permission to go into Scotland. He's got his retinue. They were called truce days. And again, this goes back straight to the Legions of Mashurim. The truce days operated from sun-up on one day to sun-up on the next day. So essentially, what you've got is 24 hours whereby you have a complete truce, which means that no matter how bad the feuds are, and deadly feud was a massive part of this, because you've got families that killed brothers and other, it all went on, and families would be at feud with each other. So that was another part of this. But in the truce day, you could not enact that. That had to be set aside, supposedly.
I was going to say, I bet nobody ever broke that.
Of course they didn't. No. They're all very God-fearing people. Of course they wouldn't do anything like that, which I'll come to in a minute.
Yeah, there's actually a story in the Lions of the Red Rose book about truce days being sabotaged during the Wars of the Roses.
Yes.
And Richard, Duke of York, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, teaming up, and it eventually escalating to the point of them getting as far as Edinburgh, where King James III of Scotland is holed up, and it all seems to have started with truce days being
with a
sabotaged.
single truce day. Yeah. That wouldn't be anywhere surprised. No, that doesn't surprise me at all. But the whole idea was it was supposed to be a peaceful day. The idea was that it had the air of a fair day. You'd have tinkers and people selling stuff and pies, horse racing, that kind of thing. So they go into Scotland, they have an area, and then the idea was you were supposed to have a jury of 12 good men and true. Now, find that in the Borders at that time. You'd be extremely lucky. The guy who's judging you is just as guilty as you are. But the idea was that the Scottish jury was supposed to try the English bills, and the English bills got tried by the Scottish ones. Okay. Try and keep it fair. Yeah. Didn't really work out like that. But oddly enough, the families did turn up. You'd think, oh, well, the families might just laugh at that, and not. They didn't, because if they didn't turn up, they were what's called put to the horn, which essentially meant they were made outlaws, complete outlaws. And that wasn't a very good thing, because then you're out bounds of everybody then, which you don't want to do. So you turn up, you plead either guilty or not guilty. Generally not guilty. You would turn around and say, no, I wasn't there, I was with Sam Elliott or whatever. But they generally got sorted out. However, there was a very famous incident which occurred with a guy called William Armstrong of Kinmont. He's known as Willie Armstrong. He was riding, he'd had a truce day. He's now riding on the other side of this river, and the English troopers are on the other side. And of course, they're taunting. He's giving it, hey, whatever. And the English troopers got annoyed about it. So they forded the river, and they went and got him. This is in complete contravention of a truce day. It's not supposed to happen. But they took him. Then he took him off to Carlisle. Now, what should have happened was the warden there, who was known as Scroop, a strange name, but his name was Lord Scroop. Lord Scroop should have just basically turned around and said, you shouldn't have done that, let him go. But he didn't. He threw him in a cell. And that provoked an international incident between England and Scotland. And in the end, between all of this going on, his mates got a bit annoyed about this. And the bold Duke of Buccleuch, as he's known, he decides what he's going to do. He's going to organise a raid to get Kinmont Willie out. So, just to cut a long story short, they manage, the River Eden is in full sway, they managed to get across that. They managed to get through what's called a postern door. Now, you have a postern door on your gates here. It's a small door set in the middle of a main gate. They managed to get through that. Now, nobody's quite sure if they battered that down or if somebody was bribed to let them in. I suggest the latter one was probably the possible one. So they managed to get in, and they free Kinmont. Well, they free Kinmont Armstrong. So they get him out. And, of course, this again provokes a fury from Elizabeth, who's in London, who hears about all of this, provokes an absolute fury from her, because she basically angrily demands, who's dare done this? And she demands that Buccleuch goes in front of him, which 8 months later he does. And he walks in, and she angrily demands, what sort of man did this to my royal residence, to my people? And his answer is brilliant. He turned around and said, what would a man be if he did not dare? And Elizabeth liked the answer, and she let him go. So there you go. But we didn't finish with the wardens. So that was one of the duties of the wardens. Another duty, of course, was espionage. Because Henry Percy here before the Battle of Devil's Cross, we'll talk about that in another one. But he was asked by the English king to send spies into Scotland to find out what was going on. That was one thing that they did. But also espionage played a later part because your favourite friend, Mr. John Forster, who apparently the Percys don't get on very well with.
Yes, well, I'll tell you a little bit about Sir John Forster.
Yeah, go on.
I mentioned it before, his connections to Alnwick Castle.
Yes.
So when the 7th Earl of Northumberland rebelled against Elizabeth I in the Rising of the Northern Earls, or the Rising of the North, the castle was garrisoned by Percy's supporters.
Mm-hmm.
So Sir John Forster, who was warden of the Middle Marches at that time,
indeed, yes.
advanced against the castle, and the garrison surrendered to him.
Yes.
So that's strike one against the castle for him. When the Earl fled from the rebellion, Forster was given possession of the castle and helped then escort the 7th Earl of Northumberland back from Scotland, from Alnwick to York to be
York.
executed. Strike two, I'm afraid.
Strike two. Yeah, he wasn't well thought.
He then plundered the contents of Alnwick Castle to furnish his own to furnish his own home at Alnwick Abbey.
Saintly Sir John, I can't see him doing anything like that.
So Alnwick Abbey's doing quite well, but the castle isn't. Strike three.
Yeah.
And then while he was resident at Alnwick Abbey, which is in Holm Park, just west of the castle, he grazed his cattle in parts of the parkland that weren't his. The park keepers tried to drive the cattle away. Forster's men then threatened them with their swords and halberds. This was a disruption of the peace, which, according to
the disruption of the peace, I love that, dude. That's a fantastic word for the borders, isn't it?
Yeah. So, according to the former archivist here, Colin Shrimpton, it caused the bailiff of Alnwick to ring the castle bell to sound the alarm, which was a very rare thing for Alnwick Castle's bell to do. So, strike four, he is completely out, and that's why we're not the biggest fans. Of Sir
No
John
rehabilitation for this man,
No.
and he was a rogue. There's no two ways about it. But given the fact of what his reputation was and how he actually operated, because he was very much a borderer. He was actually one of the Forster family, so the Forsters were a borderer family. He was very astute. He knew what border families would do. But also as well, given the fact of what he did, he actually died in his own bed, peacefully.
Amazing.
It's strange. But one of the things he actually did, maybe this rehabilitates him a little bit. Okay. His troopers in 1582, they discover a man out on the moors. And he won't give his name. He gets described as a grey-cowled man. So he won't give his name, so they arrest him. When they arrest him, they take some of his luggage away. Now, in true border style, they get bribed. So the troopers get given this massive amount of bribe and just let him go. However, they've still got hold of the luggage. So John Forster, whose troopers they are, finds out about this, throws them in jail. He then starts to examine what's been there. But two of the things, he had dentistry instruments, because he's just wandering around like a quack dentist, if you like. He's wandering around. But he's also got a looking glass, a magnifying glass. And he sees a tiny scrap of paper wedged in between two pieces of this glass. So he undoes it, opens the paper up, and there's a cipher inside of that, a code. So all of this gets bundled up, gets sent down to Francis Walsingham, Sir Francis Walsingham in London, who, of course, is Elizabeth's chief spymaster. Walsingham then has it decoded, and it is the first time you ever see in history the words "the Enterprise of England" used. And what they're talking about is the Spanish Armada, because that was its actual official title, the Enterprise of England. And what they've happened on is the plot. And they've also done two things. Now, this actually helped in two respects. One, Walsingham actually managed to get a jump onto this secret pipeline of messages that Mary Queen of Scots was exchanging with France. So that was good for them, because they could now, that eventually, of course, helped to go to her downfall. But also as well, because they'd now been alerted that something was going on, they put a man into the shipyards where these vessels were being built and provisioned. So this guy, he was a clerk, he reported back to Walsingham on everything. And when that armada sailed, as Walsingham said, we knew, because of this man, everything down to the last lentil that was actually on this fleet. So maybe that rehabilitates him a touch.
Maybe a bit.
Maybe
a bit. But
good old Sir John.
Enough of Sir John Forster.
Yes.
We'll move on to the Percys, because they were a big presence in Northumberland throughout most of this period, give or take the odd rebellion.
Yes, yeah. Give or take the odd rebellion.
How active were they in either subduing or maybe supporting any reiving?
Very, because the Percy family, again, they hold the wardenry. Because of that, as wardens, they have to be supportive of the law. They have no choice. But of course, that doesn't mean to say they won't look the other way if certain things are good for them. They definitely worked in support of that. But the warden's office is and it's quite a really busy one, because you imagine he's got to do all the correspondences, and you can actually see some of those correspondences. There is a book called The Calendar of Border Papers, 2 volumes if I remember rightly, and they're all the letters that get sent down to London on reports, and you can actually see how busy they actually are. And Percys do actually do the reports, and they send them down, and you can see that they've been raiding against so-and-so, they've taken so-and-so prisoner, they've done that. So they're active as wardens, without any doubt. This family very much, I hesitate to use the term, but Wardens of the North really does come to it, because they really were. They held those 3 offices at each, over a 200-year period, they'd held all 3 offices. So they were very important indeed to the border, and of course as a big family. And of course here, you've got a massive castle that nobody's ever going to attack. And this becomes headquarters, or one of the headquarters, of the English March Warden, the Middle March Warden, of which they were one.
Were things different on the Scottish side of the border? You mentioned Liddesdale.
Yes, Liddesdale, because it was so lawless, they actually end up with somebody they call the Keeper. Now, the Keeper was actually a man who lived at Hermitage Castle. Now, if ever you go to Hermitage Castle, it's one of the grimmest looking castles you'll ever see. Somebody actually told, in a very polite way, they actually said it's get stuffed in stone, which it really is. You wouldn't want to be there. One of the most famous ones of the Keepers was a guy called Hepburn, and he was Mary Queen of Scots' lover at the end. That's what he becomes. But one of the Hepburns, his job as ward, he's literally a subordinate to the Middle March Warden. So he's out one day, and he sees a guy called Jock Elliot. Now, little Jock Elliot, as they call him, has caused major, major problems for him. So he decides, that's it, we're going to deal with this. So he shoots Jock Elliot out of the saddle, and he thinks that's the end of it. So, just to make sure, gets off his saddle, walks across, but that's not the end for Elliot, because Elliot is still alive. He's injured, but he's still alive, and he's got hold of his sword. And as Hepburn gets closer, the Earl of Bothwell, as he actually is, as he gets closer, Elliot whips round, stabs him, and of course he reels away injured, and he's injured. He managed to get on his horse and get away, and both men survived. And it kind of gives you the idea of what the borders actually were like, and what borderers themselves were like. And it's actually in the ballad, because these all things went into songs, the ballads of these people, because families would celebrate their history. And it gives you an idea. And I'll try and do this in a sort of Scots accent so you get the idea.
Okay.
And it says, I ride on my fleet-footed grey, my sword hanging down by my knee. My name is Little Jock Elliot, and why damn meddle with me? That gives you an idea of what these people were like.
Yeah.
Who dares meddle with me? Now, interestingly, the Archbishop of Glasgow, in about 1514, I think it was, around about the 1540s, he decided, 1525, he decided, his name was Gavin Dunbar, and he decided he'd had enough of the Reivers. He'd had enough of his parishioners getting attacked, he'd had enough of this. Because, of course, Glasgow then would cover a massive area, the parishioners. And he decides to make the Great Cursing. And he reads this out from the pulpit. And His Grace must have taken a long time to write this, because it takes 20 minutes to read out the whole thing.
A curse.
Yes, a curse. And this is distributed to every church and every chapel in the border region, so it has to be read out. And just to give you a flavour of how annoyed he actually was, he says things like, I curse the head and all the hairs of the head. I curse their face, their eyes, their mouth, their nose, their tongue, their teeth, their skull. He goes on. And he also talks about every part of their body, from the top of their head to the sole of their feet, before and behind, within and without. I curse them going, I curse them riding, I curse them standing, I curse them sitting, I curse them eating, I curse them drinking, and etc., etc.
For 20 minutes.
For 20 minutes. He calls down hellfire on these people. He's excommunicating them. Did it make any difference to the Reivers? Not a jot.
No.
They were still people who would nail a list of demands, because one thing that we haven't talked about is how they've given names to things to our language. The word bereaved comes from Reivers. If you were bereaved, you'd had all your stuff taken. Of course, we use the word bereaved, that somebody's died. You are now bereaved.
Yeah.
Which, of course, they did. They killed people in the pursuit of the business, if you like. That's what they did. So they had that. And you look at that and you think, there's one thing. But they also invented blackmail. Protection rackets. Nothing new. That's what they did. They would come along and they would basically say, right, if you pay us money, we'll make sure you don't get raided. And if you do get raided, we'll go on behalf of you. And if we raid anywhere, we'll leave you alone. And it actually did work. There is a one where they actually raided, I think it was the Armstrongs, they raided a certain area and they inquired as to where this lady was who'd actually paid them protection money. And when they were told, they left that alone. They didn't touch it. So it did actually work. The mafia, they made the mafia, all these gangs, they made the mafia look small fry. They really do. Unbelievable.
Without wanting to anger the mafia at all.
Yeah, without wanting to anger the mafia, but they were very much the forerunners. I think the mafia would have loved them, to be honest with you. I think they were all that.
So the Bishop of Glasgow's curse doesn't stop them.
Nope, not at all.
The Percys' attempts as wardens don't put an end. The true stays don't necessarily work. But reiving doesn't happen anymore, so what happened to allow it to die off and die out?
Well, you've got... Elizabeth is obviously approaching the end of her life. And eventually, of course, Elizabeth dies. And that triggers one of the March Wardens, Sir Robert Carey. He went from London to Edinburgh to give James the news that Elizabeth had died. And he actually bursts in, panting. He's been on this horse. And he gives James of Scotland the word that Elizabeth has died.
Beating the Earl of Northumberland's envoy by a couple of hours.
By a couple of hours, which again caused problems. Sir Robert Carey was not known for subtlety most of the time. But he's a very interesting guy. But when they do that, James becomes James the First of England. So you've got James the VI of Scotland now becomes James the First of England and Ireland. Now that means he decides to declare, because he knows how bad the borders are, so he declares the borders the Middle Shires. And overnight, the borderline is gone. And it's interesting because the 2 weeks before Elizabeth dies are known as the ill weeks. And the raiding really took off in those weeks. And you get the idea, they had this idea that this way of life was going to change, and they were just going to make the last best of it. So James makes the Middle Shires, the borderline disappears, so no more can you slip across the border and evade justice from England or from Scotland the other way.
So it wasn't that the families stopped hating each
No,
other.
no,
They
not
couldn't
at all.
escape justice.
They couldn't
anymore.
escape justice. There was no escape from now. And James also went into the borders and he created what they called justice, which essentially meant he went in, hanged people wholesale, he exported families. And of course, sadly, the bold Duke of Buccleuch that we talked about before, Walter Scott, he turned coat. He actually went on James's side and he helped to actually hang families and things like that. He was one of those. So he sold his own people out. Not a nice guy, really, at the end of the day. But all those families, some of them ended up in the Low Countries, fighting wars there, because one of the things they were actually brilliant horse troops. That was the whole idea behind them. They were used as horse troops, and they were very, very effective for it. They were some of the finest light horsemen in the world at that time, because they had these massive long lances that they used to prick cattle, but they could also be used in warfare. They were great scouts and things like that. And at the Battle of Flodden, they were used as a striking force, and they did a very good job of it. They also plundered their own side before they went home, of course. That's, there we go. So we've got them exported. But also as well, they exported them to Ireland, particularly the Graham family. Now, the Grahams were known as a nest of vipers. That's how they get described, because they are so predatory. They get exported on pain of death to return to England. But they do. Some do. But they return as Mahag, which is Graham spelled backwards.
Oh. Okay.
However, a lot of them also went to America. When they could. They went to America, to the New World. They went to America. And it's no coincidence that what you end up with, that the first man on the moon was Neil Armstrong, one of the Armstrongs.
Interplanetary.
He actually traced his lineage, actually, he was from Langham. And he actually went back there, and they celebrate the fact that he came from there. But his actual ancestors were from Langham. So they were all reivers. Now, I think the reivers would have loved that idea.
Reivers on the moon.
But what they would have done is turn around and say, while you're on your way back, make sure to take some steel with you. We need the money. That's how they would do it. But it is fascinating. But literally, that's what happened to them. They died out. But there were still some diehards. There were people, there are moss troopers who were known all the way through until the late 17th century. But They died out simply because there was no borderline anymore. You couldn't make use of it anymore. Even their horses sadly died out because they rode what were called Galloway nags. And they're not big horses, but they would travel forever. They could go anywhere they needed to. They were unshod most of the time. They didn't have horseshoes on them because they needed to be sure-footed on the fells. The Galloway, again, through James, ends up dying out. The nearest you get to it now is the American quarter horse. But just to show you how exasperated the border officials could actually get with these people, they had two sayings that we used with them. One was, if Jesus Christ was amongst them, they would deceive him. So that gives you an idea.
That's not good.
And these are, according to Thomas Musgrave, who was a very harassed border official at the time, he said, they are men who will be Scottish at their will and English at their pleasure. So in other words, they could use the borderline for their convenience.
Wow.
Amazing.
So just before we finish then, you mentioned George MacDonald Fraser's book as maybe the essential companion. Where else can people go to find out more?
You can find a lot online now. How I started finding it, strangely enough, was an article that was on the North East News, and I just caught the end of it, and I heard the word border reiver, and I didn't have a clue what they were. I didn't actually realise at the end until my wife knew, but she never told me, and it turns out I'm actually married to one. Her maiden name was Liddell, which comes from Little, which they were from Liddesdale. They were Liddell from Liddesdale. So the Liddell and Little is because of course names slipped a little bit. So how you spelt something would change. So they're actually from Liddell, which is Liddesdale. And they were a very predatory lad, so I'm very careful. But if people want to do more research, look online. There's plenty of that. There's plenty of books. The Steel Bonnet is the best place to start. George MacDonald Fraser, it's one of the best books out there. There's also a good book by a guy called Borland, The Border Reivers, and I think his name's Angus Moffat. He did a wonderful series called The Reivers and the Making of the Borders. So if you want, there's plenty of information out there. It's just tracking it down and finding it. And most people seem to be quite proud of the fact when they find out that their
from a Reiver
ancestors
family.
were cattle rustlers and thieves, and of course they would take even nails if they could get away with it. You know, they took windows away from places if they needed to, if they found them.
On that note of recommendation, we'll say thank you very much for telling us all about the Reivers.
Thank you very much indeed. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's always good to talk medieval history with Andy, and you can hear from him live and in person during his regular appearances at the castle during our opening season. Check the website for full dates and details. If you'd like to hear more from Andy on the podcast, head into our archive and look for episodes 49 and 63, where he speaks about medieval archery. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any further episodes. We also appreciate any reviews or 5-star ratings you can leave us. Join us again in 2 weeks for another episode looking at a different part of Alnwick Castle history. Until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.